As the battle for Earth commences, a small group of independent ships from the remnants of humanity have positioned themselves in the vanguard for the strike on New York. Fueled by a romanticism for their ancestral homeland, they've tasked themselves with gathering as much intelligence as they can on the current state of the city, as well as wiping out as much of the Scourge as possible. For their part, the Scourge divert what forces they can, and follow their usual modus operandi, looking to claim as many hosts as possible, and strike down the leader of the invading human forces to break their morale. So we decided to run one of the narrative-occupied New York scenarios. Fittingly, we'll have a Scourge versus Resistance match on it, with Scourge being the defenders and Resistance attackers. So it's an asymmetric scenario. Notable things about it, there are two large drop sites that have a couple power plants, as well as the Scourge anti-orbital guns. The two small drop sites have different New York features. One is Nova Prospect, which gives you an anti-boarding defense if you're hanging around it, basically. The other one is One World Trade Center, which helps you relocate battalions from other drop sites to this one, and also boosts your scan. We actually kind of forget about that scan thing for the first round or two. Next, some scenery pieces just get kind of randomly thrown out on the table. We've got ourselves two micrometeorite fields right here, and then 4 debris fields. And the other thing you'll notice here is there's a Scourge fleet station here that was actually picked as part of the Scourge fleet build, just sort of thematically appropriate, because it makes sense that Scourge would have some defensive space stations hanging around here. So the other thing we decided to do was try out using a famous admiral. Originally, this was going to be a 1,500 point game, but we realized to use the admirals we wanted, we had to be in a larger scale battle, so now we're in a 2,001 point game. Said admiral for me being Nguyen, who is a level 4 admiral in a Olympus. His whole deal is just ships with multiple vent cannons are better, they can overcharge everything. Of course, it means they're more likely to blow themselves up. And the other ability I took was Sabotage, because I'm worried that they will be able to entrench themselves in those drop sites that have all the orbital guns, and I want to be able to shut that down if necessary. And so to go with the vent cannon ability, I have a pair of gladiators. I actually only own a single gladiator model, so the Centurion is being proxied as a gladiator. And the first of 2 battlecruisers would be the Triumvir, which is there for fighter support because I'm expecting a lot of bombers from the Scourge, as well as just the repairability and box of scraps tokens, which are just generally useful. The other battlecruiser being the Senator. It is there for exactly its intended purpose, which is clearing out any drop sites that have been overrun by the enemy. Since they all start on the opponent side of the board in this scenario, I'm expecting I might have to use that. And then for more fighter and possibly bomber coverage, I have 2 cruisers that have 2 launch bays each. They have a blade of armor, and then they also have the hybrid gun. They do not have the vent cannon turret as modeled on here. That was modeled for the previous edition, the new edition of the game. You cannot launch when on weapons free. Vent cannon turrets want to go weapons free to overcharge, so adding a single vent cannon turret alongside launch bays is a pretty terrible build right now. And then closing out medium tonnage are 2 cruisers with double bombardment and double bulk landers. And then for more drop, I have an Aldrin, which should hopefully be a bit more durable because it has descent. And to try out something I've never used before, I have a Collins. It launches a single fighter bomber and also provides a little bit of support to the fighter rerolls. Then 2 groups of 2 strike carriers, all with the sensor domes, so they will be dropping and detecting. And lastly, 3 Munifexes. They might help kill things. They're just cheap. That's why they're there. I had the points for them. It's only 45, 15 points each. And as alluded to in the narrative intro, my secondary objectives are going to be gather intel and annihilate. The Scourge fleet is designed to lean into launch and boarding actions. We've got the Overlord of Flies, which is a level 4 admiral and a Nosferatu. Its deal is that it has higher launch than usual, but all those bombers and fighters have to stick kind of close to it. 14-inch bubble is pretty big, so it shouldn't be too bad, but you cannot just leave it on the back of the board and spew out fighters and do nothing else. Also, my opponent took augmentations because their plan is to be dropping orbital guns on all of the drop sites since they're so close to their side of the table. And high-speed launch to hopefully complement the Haruko, I believe. Next, we got ourselves a Dragon. It's there to stay on theme with some torpedoes and some launch. Banshee is there for more of the same, specifically the torpedoes. And to finish bulking out their launch, 2 Hydras. A group of 2 Ifrits is there to try to lean a little more into the damage over time, boarding, fire kind of theme. Next, their primary source of drop is 3 Lamasus. So the thinking here is they don't need something like a Chimera because all the drop sites are on their side of the table, and a Lamasu works really well with augmentations because you're only sacrificing 2 bulk landed drops versus the potential 4 from a Chimera. 3 individual gargoyles fill out the remainder of their drop, and 2 groups of 3 Haruko each are there to just wreak havoc with their boarding pods. Next, mostly just for the sake of it being a narrative fit, we have a Scourge fleet station. This is the Nematocyst, which has just got a burn-through laser kind of thing on it. And for their secondary objectives, they're looking at take prizes. So between the Harukos and the torpedoes, they're hoping to get some boarding action going, and decapitate. So they're at this point hoping that my Nguyen blows himself up and makes that pretty easy. But take prizes is probably going to be the easier one for them to do. And to beginning of round 1, Scourge gets to directly deploy, so they form themselves a nice little line along that triangular deployment zone. Resistance, on the other hand, has to deploy from off the table with the close deployment type. And first activation of the game is a gargoyle, which moves on silent running up towards the central drop site. First thing I bring on the board is a carrier. It launches some fighters. I'm expecting to do nothing but fighter launching, and I expect them to do nothing but bomber launching. So we'll see how that goes. Up next, one of the other gargoyles, again up towards the central drop site on silent running. I also do a repeat of my first activation, with the other carrier coming on and launching a handful of fighters. They move their Lamasu onto the One World Trade Center drop site, and use 3 AP to get an orbital gun down with augmentations. I still don't want to commit to anything with the guns on it yet, so I bring in my third sort of carrier with the Collins, and it launches its lone fighter into the middle of the deployment area. They feel largely the same, it seems, and just have drop continue to move, with the Lamasu dropping some battalions down on the large drop site closest to their deployment. And more launch. The Triumvir moves up and discourages a wing of fighters. And a box of scrap token gets put on itself. Nova Prospect is claimed by a Lamasu, dropping 2 battalions on it. I move my first drop onto the table with one of the Bulklander bombardment cruisers, and 2 fire ships get launched out of it. And Scourge activate their first launch. They deploy some bombers from one of the Hydras. I'm still keeping guns off the table with the other bombardment Bulklander cruiser moving on, and also launching 2 fire ships. The last of the 3 gargoyles activates, moving into atmosphere over One World Trade Center and putting a battalion down onto that drop site. I decide I should bring on the gladiators now. They max thrust because their thrust is terrible, and move up along the bottom edge of the board. The Scourge's other Hydra activates, and 3 more bombers make it onto the table. So I realized that my opponent made a bit of a mistake with the placement of their fleet space station. It's just a little bit too close to my deployment, to the point where if I spike it up to the max, I will be able to target it with my next activation. And so I put the strike carriers up and use their sensor domes to do just that. The Scourge then move the Dragon up the board and launch a torpedo and its complement of bombers. They could have actually launched both the torpedoes, but they just kind of forgot to do that. It doesn't really matter in the end. Nguyen moves on to the table, and I don't go weapons free because I don't want the spikes, but I think that it should have the firepower to take out that station anyway. And so it does go down. Frankly, I'm kind of grateful for this, that we got to take it out before it activated, because a lot of questions came up concerning the fleet space station rules. For one, we weren't really sure if there was any way for the station to actually lose those spikes it had, and whatever, it's dead now. Yay. The Akuma activates, it just moves towards Nova Prospect, doesn't launch its torpedo or anything. Another uneventful activation, the Senator comes onto the table and moves towards the center. One of the Hiruko groups then moves into position to probably pounce on something next round. And my Aldrin moves on max thrust towards the center as well. I think I could have moved it farther up the table, but I forgot about my own deployment zone being an actual triangle thing and not just the table edge directly. Oh well. It's going to come down to the initiative next round, whether I can get some of my battalions down before the gargoyles can get something of theirs. We'll see. If Ifrits move up, nothing in range, so they just hang out. My other group of strike carriers moves on, and I'm not really completely certain at this point what to spike. I don't think it matters too much because a lot of things are just going to drop spikes at the start of next round, and they're still pretty far away. So I just dump them onto two gargoyles because those are closest. And the second group of Haruko move up the other side of the table. I max thrust the Munifex into the middle of the board and put them down into atmosphere. I don't expect them to necessarily accomplish anything, I just want to pose a bit of a threat to those two gargoyles. The Overlord of Flies moves up on general quarters and drops two wings of bombers, four in each. It then opens fire on the Munifexes. It does get one hit through, but the hit is saved. And thus is the last ship activation. Drop sites could activate, but there's nothing there to really do, and so we move on to assets. First up is fighters, where my fighters fly straight up ahead, and also there's a little bit of wing joining happening as well. Bombers are next, and the Scourge bombers go first as they have the initiative. There is some wing formation, and they fly ahead a little. And my opponent spends the remaining 2 AP on an extra thrust for one of the bomber wings. And my two fireship wings trundle up their whole 3 inches. And lastly for the round, the torpedo plows ahead. At the start of the round, the Scourge give the Lamasu high-speed launch at the cost of 1 AP. I think they're probably planning to put a augmentation tower down on that backfield drop site while still being able to move up towards the center. As Scourge secured initiative this round, they are able to get a battalion down into that center drop site, which means my Aldrin will now only put 2 battalions down as opposed to the full 4 it could if I had 1 initiative. So even though I didn't get the jump on that central drop site, and I'm only going to end up probably tied with 2 battalions from my Aldrin and 2 from the 2 gargoyles, I activate the Aldrin and get one down right away because it's spiked, it's just ahead of everything else, and it's probably almost certainly going to die if I don't immediately get it down into atmosphere. And as expected, rather than leaving the spiked gargoyle out and exposed, they get it down to atmosphere as well, and we are now tied for 2 battalions each on the central drop site. I activate the Triumvir next, and it goes on general quarters, launching 4 fighters. I want it pretty centrally placed, both for providing fighter support for what I expect to be a lot of bombers incoming, as well as that aura of damage control, repair, whatever buff it provides. And for this activation, Box of Scraps goes on the Aldrin. My opponent activates the Hydra closer to Nova Prospect and launches another wing of 3 bombers directly adjacent to the existing wing. I respond with my carrier that's on that side of the board as well, and add 4 more fighters to my defense screen. And the stacking of yet more launch assets continues, as the topside Hydra decides that it's going to also dump out some more bombers. The Nova Prospect side bulk lander also spews out a couple fire ships. The Lamasu hanging out over One World Trade Center drops down a couple battalions, and the Senator moves ahead on silent running. I'm not super sure and confident how I'm going to be using this thing. I right now expect to clear out a overrun central drop site and then either bank it towards one of the small drop sites or charge ahead to the one that's in the far Scourge corner and hopefully clear it out to at least deny some scoring. I don't know. And the Lamasu over Nova Prospect farther reinforces the battalions hanging out down there. I'm now going to try to put the Overload of Flies into a vulnerable position. It has a pretty large base signature, and with full spikes, pretty much anything I have is going to be able to see it. Now, it hasn't activated yet, and I want to have it not hang back the entire round so I can get a shot off on it. So I'm hoping that I will force it to activate next to drop the spikes, and then my other strike carriers can spike it up again, and I'll be able to fire on it with things. We'll see how it goes. My opponent realizes the precarious situation their admiral is in. What they could do is they could go on silent running, drop all the spikes, and also lower their pretty huge sig down to 0, and then I almost certainly wouldn't be able to fire them this round, even if I spike them back up with my other strike carrier group, which I'm certainly going to do. But then they would miss out on the 8 bombers launch. That is a lot of offense that they don't want to lose. So what they decide is they're going to go down in atmosphere. The Dreadnought takes 4 points of damage, but they do shit all the spikes, and they do launch the 8 bombers. And they're hoping that the Lock Malice that I will face shooting at them is going to result in taking less damage than they would have from those 4 points in the atmosphere. So of course I oblige and put the spikes right back on with the other strike carrier group. I move them ahead just enough to keep them out of range of the Haruko as well. The dragon activates and fires on the Munifexes. We do something pretty stupid and we use the wrong profile. We looked at the demon page, not the dragon page, and had it fire the Oculus Beam flanks, even though it clearly doesn't have it, and we launch immediately afterwards. Okay, it's not the end of the world. It's just a couple of Munifexes. But yeah, they go down. Oh well. The Dragon then launches its other torpedo and another wing of 3 bombers. Collins sticks to the center of the board for similar reasons as the Triumvir and drops out a fighter. The Banshee moves into range of the strike carrier group and opens fire with the close action plasma. It could have hung back a little farther because the other mistake we made besides the one we just did with the Metafixes is forgetting about the fact that One World Trade Center gives you plus 3 inches to your scan. Oh well. 3 damage makes it into the strike carrier group, which is not enough to kill one of the ships. They also launch a torpedo. We are out of torpedo tokens, though, at least ones that are painted like Scourge colors. And so we just use a Razor Worm base because that's what the torpedoes are carrying anyway. And out come 2 more fire ships as one of the bulk lander cruisers heads up to the top half of the board. The third and final Amasu activates and takes advantage of the rapid drop it got at the start of the round, putting down an orbital gun with augmentations on the home corner of the Scourge and moves ahead towards the center. One of my carriers activates, I put some fighters out, except I'm completely out of fighter tokens now for resistance. So I use a pile of rusted barrels because I think that's a similar technological level as most resistance spacecraft from what I understand. The Ifrit duo move on the Aldrin. It's in atmosphere, so they need 6s to hit. I think they're just hoping to get a couple points, and they're not going to be able to get fire started with their guns because you can't crit on things in atmosphere. They manage to get a point of damage through. I activate the Gladiator pair, and this is where a new rule comes to bite me in the ass. I completely forgot about the whole bases cannot overlap thing when I was moving my stuff around, and I wanted to have them fire all of their guns at the Overlord of Flies, but the bulk carrier and regular carrier cruisers are in the way. So rather than getting to fire everything at the Overlord, I am going to fire the front-facing guns at the Banshee and fire the turrets at the Overlord. I also spend the 2 AP on Nguyen's ability, the Vent Cannon Mastery, which means that I can overcharge both of the Vent Cannon weapons on the Gladiators. End result, I inflict the same amount of damage to them as I take myself. The Banshee does some great saves, and only 1 hit of 4 damage gets through. The Overlord gets very few hits thanks to going down atmosphere. It turns out that was the right move for it, and the only hit that it does get through, it saves. The Gladiators each take 2 damage from overcharge, so that didn't work out great for me. Afterwards, the Hiroko that were hanging out around One World Trade Center move into position to strike on some of my stuff next round. Now it's time for the other hopefully big play for me. Nguyen moves ahead, spends 2 AP on Vent Cannon Mastery, and goes weapons free, dumping everything into the Overlord of Flies. This went a little better for me this time, although not fantastic. The atmosphere again helped it a little bit, not as much as the previous time, but 2 or 3 hits that would have made through didn't. And I do take a comparable but not identical amount of damage. The backlash from overcharge is hurting me almost as much as the guns are hurting them. The Overlord takes 8 damage, Wen takes 6. I do hit the crippling threshold, and they roll a navigation offline. The other Haruko group max thrusts behind my firing line into the relative safety right behind my various cruisers. Drop site activation is again skipped because the only relevant drop site is the middle one, which is contested. The other 3 are controlled by the Scourge, but there's nothing in range, and they don't want to use the One World Trade Center relocation ability. So for battalion combat, they wipe each other out, and the central drop site has no one present in it anymore. My fighters now move into position to take out multiple bomber wings, and they successfully neutralize 4 out of the 6 bomber wings present on the table. My opponent uses their last AP on Limitless Pestilence, which lets them dump a bomber out of their Overlord of Flies, since I wiped all of those other ones out with my fighters. For the bombers, the Scourge moved their two surviving wings into a good spot to strike on my ships next round. They weren't able to reach any this time. I do have a lot less fighters this time, so I may not be able to wipe them out, considering they are going to be dumping even more on next round. We'll see how it goes. For my part of the bomber phase, the four wings of fire ships waddle their way up another 3 inches. As for torpedoes, the two around the middle of the board position themselves like the bombers to hit next round, but the one near the strike carriers on the bottom collides with my strike carrier. The torpedo inflicts 2 damage points to that strike carrier and disgorges 2 battalions of razor worms onto it. And luckily for my opponent, they roll to repair navigation offline on their dreadnought. We arrive at the end of round 2. The battle lines have started to collide with each other. As for the drop site control, the Scourge still have control of 3 out of the 4, while the central site is going to have some serious contesting happening soon. To start the round off, the Haruko go on course change to stay close to all my cruisers there, and dump 3 battalions into the increasingly beleaguered Gladiator. I want to start targeting some of their drop, so with my strike carriers, after moving them over the Nova Prospect drop site, I spike up the Lamasu in the middle of the board. My opponent tries to finish off at least one of those strike carriers with the Hydra, but it fails to damage anything, and they launch 3 bombers afterwards. Now I try to take out their Banshee with my Gladiator pair. I spend 3 AP on Vent Cannon Mastery, and thanks to some great saves, they keep the Banshee flying. However, my Gladiator that is already boarded and on fire suffers a backlash from the overcharge and cripbles itself, putting defenses offline on top of everything else. Their Banshee responds in kind by targeting my Bulklander bombardment cruiser. It puts just enough damage through to cripple it, triggering a scanner's offline. Then the Banshee launches its second torpedo. I am out of torpedo tokens, so this time I use a Spectre skim tank, because it looks kinda torpedo-y. I decide I should get some boots on the ground now, and with the Aldrin, I put down the full 4 battalions on top of one of the Scourge batteries in the central drop site. My opponent wants to keep up the boarding action, and they shove the other group of Harukos right in my topmost carrier's face. 3 damage from their plasma torches, and 3 boarders onto the carrier. The Collins acts as a pseudo-pass token, not doing anything but launching a fighter. And my boarded carrier is now facing down an attack from the Dragon. And it goes quite well for the Scourge. Not a lot of damage, but a fire, and it's crippled with weapons offline. So that thing is insured to be dead next round, essentially, and can't do anything this round. Also, 3 bombers pop out. My other carrier moves up and takes aim at the Banshee, and I chip away with 1 point of damage and launch 4 fighters. I am now out of fighter tokens, and so I am using fighters as my token. The Scourge's other Hydra moves up and fires at the carrier for the hell of it. No real reason to do it because it's going to get captured next activation and it has weapons offline and can't do anything. But, Scourge should want to shoot things. Doesn't matter because no damage gets through, and they launch their bombers. With scanners offline, there's nothing I can actually fire at with the bombardment cannon, so I just move my Bulklander closer to a drop site and launch some fire ships next to the Banshee. Lamasu now tries to finish off one of those straight carriers with its plasma bombs. It fails to hit though, and just drops some more battalions down on the drop site. I do an aggressive max thrust with the Bulklander bombardment cruiser, and I pretty much regret it right afterwards when I spend more than 2 seconds thinking about it, but it was just an impulsive, I'm going to slam my shit up backfield and just they can deal with it move. Oh well. The Lamasu near that drop site activates, tries to fire at the Bulklander I just moved up, fails the damage though, and just puts some more battalions down. My Triumpher moves into position to help with the repair of the scanners offline on the Bulklander cruiser, and also drops some extra fighters using again a fighter as my fighter token in the middle of the board. And the box of scraps token also goes on the same Bulklander. A gargoyle activates, puts down a battalion. I max thrust the very, very poor condition carrier up the board for no real reason. It's not even going to explode because it's going to end up being captured by the battalions on board, so no point in leaving it next to the Haruko back there. So I don't know, I just moved it up because maybe it'll block some movement for the Dreadnought? I don't know. The central spiked Lamasu now moves over the big drop site in the center and aims to bombard it to clear out my battalions. It gets 2 points of damage through, cutting my battalions in half, and then spends 3 AP to put down their own orbital laser gun with augmentations. And first off, sorry for this picture being even more blurred than some of the other ones. The senator moves up and targets the Lamasu, and the Lamasu gets taken down. So far, I've been disappointed that I haven't had a good opportunity to use those VX bombs, but hopefully something will arise later. And the Gargoyle moves in, drops battalion on the same orbital battery that my battalions are on, passing that Scourge battery save check. Now it's time for Nguyen to go weapons free, firing a turret pair at each group of Harukos and the broadsides at the Dreadnought. Sorry, I forgot to take the after firing picture here. The bottom group of Harukos takes 4 damage, so 2 of those are destroyed. The right side Haruko group takes 2 damage, so 1 of those is destroyed. The Scourge Dreadnought takes 6 damage, and Nguyen also takes 6 damage due to the overcharge. With the overload of flies down to only 6 hull points left, my opponent decides that it's going to go down fighting. They rise at atmosphere and take aim directly at Nguyen. I spend a reroll to make the only failed save out of all of the hits that go through, and no damage gets it to Nguyen. They then launch their 8 bombers, and they get the last activation of the round. I had a pass token, but I never really found a point where I thought it was good to use it, so it ended up just going to waste. In any case, they drop another battalion down on the central drop site, and it also passes the save requirement. And on to drop site activation. This time there is something to do here. The 2 drop sites on the back that are controlled by the Scourge and have orbital guns on them are both able to fire on the strike carriers I sent to the backfield. They only get 2 points of damage through thanks to the atmosphere hit penalty. And we made a little mistake here. We jumped right into the launch asset phase as opposed to the battalion combat and boarding actions steps. In any case, I consolidate my fighters and move them onto some of the bomber wings. Quite a few get removed, but there's still plenty of bombers on the table. And this was my big mistake with max thrusting that bulk lander cruiser up there. I didn't really count how many bombers were actually there. Even after the fighters, there's 19 bombers targeting that one cruiser. The cruiser is, of course, obliterated and rolls a full space catastrophe, so the adjacent Hydra takes 2 damage and a spike from that. My fire ships go in the move, and 4 of them target the almost dead Banshee. It's destroyed and rolls a reactor rupture, and so the 2 cruisers on top and the Haruko down there in the bottom take an extra spike. The Gladiators are already fully spiked up. Torpedo phase. The one on the bottom targets the almost dead Gladiator, and one of the ones in the middle targets the Collins. I'm not really sure why. And the other one just moves a little closer to the middle of the board. The torpedo on the Gladiator does 2 damage and drops the other 2 battalions off onto it. And the one on the Collins has all the rerolls from the fighter along with the Collins bonus, preventing any damage from happening to it. We move on to battalion combat, and first the central drop site. 2 and 2 cancel each other out, and so for another round, the central site remains uncontrolled by anyone. The Nova Prospect drop site has 6 battalions facing off against 2 of mine, so it of course stays under Scourge control. And with boarding actions, the 3 ships that have boarders on them are all captured now. I think if we had actually ordered it properly, the bottom Gladiator would actually still be around this round, of course, nearly dead and certainly going to be captured next round. But it's okay. We didn't notice this until later. We realized at the end of the next round, it's fine. And for repairs, thanks to the bonus from the Triumpher, the scanner's offline is repaired off my surviving bulklander cruiser. So we end round 3, where some damage really started getting inflicted here. Scourge are still in control out of 3 of the 4 drop sites, but next round is the first scoring round, so they have to make sure they maintain that. While using Nguyen would probably guarantee the Dreadnought goes down, I would like to be able to use his firepower on other things, so I gamble on the Gladiator with some vent cannon mastery on it, in the hopes that it does the 6 damage needed. And it does in fact do the trick. The Overlord explodes with a fuel detonation, which puts a point of damage on the Dragon and the Ifrit group. The Scourge are prioritizing getting a battalion down in that central drop site to stop the full drop of my Aldrin, and a pot shot from the Gargoyle actually puts a point of damage into said Aldrin. I go weapons free with Nguyen and put one volley of guns into the lone Hiroko, and everything else is dumped into the Dragon. Dragon is brought down to 13 hull points, and the Hiroko is wiped out. The Ifrit group reacts with weapons free to try to take down my Bulklander cruiser. They only succeed in putting in 2 damage and starting a fire, however. I activate that Bulklander cruiser now because I want to make sure I can get some drop onto the Nova Prospect drop site, and I target the Lamasu with the bombardment cannon as well. While I prefer to bombard the drop site itself, the awful foreign scan of resistance cruisers means it's out of range, and I do get a point of damage through to the Lamasu and drop down 2 battalions onto Nova Prospect. The Hydra now opens fire on the Bulklander. It does do the 2 damage required, but thanks to box of scraps, I bring it back with 2 hull. The Hydra then also launches 3 bombers. My carrier cruiser moves into support, opening fire on the Lamasu and inflicting 2 points of damage. I really would like to get it dead, but there is no way that I could inflict more than 2 points of damage with the single gun the cruiser has. I then also launch some fighters. Their purpose is just going to be to take out those bombers that are probably angling to finish off the Bulklander. Lamasu activates now, dropping its bombs on the strike carrier in an attempt to stop the balance from tipping more towards me, and it does the trick of killing my strike carrier. They also spend 3 AP on augmentations to put yet another orbital gun down on the table on the Nova Prospect drop site. I move the columns a little bit and dump a fighter out of it, nothing too notable here. The remaining 2 Harukos dive in on Nguyen. One takes a point of damage from the dense field they have to move through. It took 2 but managed to make the 6+ save for being in a group. And they open fire on Nguyen and prepare to dump some boarding pods into him. Plasma torches fail to pierce the hull, but 2 battalions make it onto Nguyen. I make a move for the backfield drop site with the Senator, max thrusting it up towards the corner. My opponent activates their second Hydra and shoots at Nguyen with it. Hits Scourge true and does 2 damage to Nguyen. The Hydra then launches its 3 bombers. I use my pass token just kind of for the hell of it, and then the Dragon activates and targets Nguyen. The Furnace Cannon style weapons continue to kind of disappoint. It just gets 2 damage through, does start 2 fires, and then they launch 3 of their bombers. Since with the Overlord of Flies down, the bomber capacity isn't as much a concern, I sacrifice launching fighters in the Triumvirate this turn to do my first gather intel on the center drop site. I also put down a box of scraps token on Nguyen. The Scourge activate the gargoyle that was hanging around One World Trade Center drop site and move it out of atmosphere on course change to start heading towards the central drop site. My Aldrin screeches up for a blistering 1 inch of movement and drops 2 battalions on the central drop site, specifically on the other orbital battery. The topside Lamasu also starts making a move towards the central drop site. I move my 2 strike carriers out of atmosphere and into orbit and towards the backfield drop site. They aren't in range to drop, and I also completely forget about detector on them, so they don't spike anything. And for the final activation of the round, the other gargoyle shifts around a little, drops a battalion on top of mine. For drop site activation, the one relevant one, the backfield one under Scourge control, I spend 2 AP to sabotage it to keep my strike carriers safe. There's 2 drop sites that are going to have battalion combat, the Nova Prospect one, which remains under Scourge control, and the central drop site where I have 2 battalions and they have one on one of the features. And so that drop site remains contested. Boarding actions of the 2 battalions on Nguyen, one inflicts damage, the other is repelled. Fighters activate now, first the wings near Nova Prospect, where I clear out that wing of bombers. And then we move on to bombers. My fire ships activate, where they inflict 2 damage to the Ifrits and clear out the Haruko. For the Scourge bombers, the 2 wings of 3 each consolidate into a single wing of 6 on top of Nguyen, where they manage to get a point of damage through, bringing Nguyen down to 6 hull points total. And lastly, the final torpedo on the table moves ahead a little bit into hopefully a better position for it. And end of phase repair, the Bulklander cruiser puts out its fire, and thanks to the adjacent triumvirate, Nguyen puts out both of his fires as well. So end of round 4 means a scoring round. If we take a look at who controls what, it's not looking great for me. Scourge has 3 of the 4 drop sites, and the middle one is contested. So if we add up the VP we get for the various controlled and contested sites, we get Scourge with a lead of 8 points, 10 versus 2. I opened the round with my bulklander cruiser. First, I bombarded the drop site to try to clear out those 2 battalions. I opened the round with my bulklander cruiser. First, I bombarded the drop site to try to clear out those 2 battalions. My opponent responds by activating the Lamasu that's right there, going on course change to turn it to get the firing arcs on and drop some bombs down. And they successfully get 2 damage down to the drop site, killing 2 of my battalions, and drop 1 of their own. I want to try to finish off the dragon before it can do anything else, so I go weapons free with one, and I get 12 damage through to the dragon. That's 1 short of killing it, but I crippled it. And so I spend 2 AP to force that damaging crippling result. They spent an AP of their own on a savior roll, but it wasn't enough. The resulting explosion damages my nearby columns. The pair of Ifrits now try to take down the gladiator. They only manage to get 2 damage through with no fires. It does cripple the gladiator though, and a defenses offline crippling result is rolled. One of the Hydras maintains its position on course change and tries to fire on Nguyen. No luck getting damage through though, so they launch 3 bombers. I really want that Lamasu dead, and thankfully I have a cruiser in position to fire a shot off at it. It does the trick, the Lamasu goes down, and I launch some bombers. In something of a repeat, the other Hydra moves onto Nguyen and tries to get some damage in, but despite being in Scald range this time, still nothing gets through. So they launch their bomber complement. So I thought I had something of a super big brain play happening here. I was going to try to block that gargoyle from moving with my Collins and Aldrin. I was doing this because the gargoyle that's off screen a bit to the north that was coming down from One World Trade Center was just within range to drop. And only if the gargoyle that I was blocking here was able to move out of the way, because now in the new version, bases can't overlap. Turns out I mismeasured and actually it could get in range fine, so I thought I was being clever, but it ended up being pointless. I am worried the Gladiator will not be long for this world if it stays down there with its defenses offline. So I activate it next and open fire with Vent Cannon Mastery and Weapons Free on the Ifrit group that's facing it down. It obliterates one of the Ifrits, putting 12 damage into the group, and suffering from 2 backlash damage due to the overcharge. While the other Ifrit had already taken enough damage to be crippled, it suffers an extra point, and the Gladiator also suffers a point of damage from the explosion of the first Ifrit. The surviving Ifrit rolls navigation offline for its crippling result. One of the gargoyles around the center activates, fires at the Aldrin, and tries to land a battalion. While it does manage to damage the Aldrin, the dropping battalion fails the save to land. My Senator goes weapons free, gets to drop the VX bomb along with all the close action missiles. It inflicts enough damage to wipe out both the battalions there, as well as the orbital gun feature that got dropped, clearing out the drop site for me. The remaining Lamasu moves into range to drop and also attempts to drop some bombs on the Aldrin. While the bombs fail to score any damage, the battalion does get dropped down on top of mine. The Triumvir launches 4 fighters. I don't actually have anything in range that I can put a box of scraps token on, so that's all it does. The other gargoyle that is currently over the central drop site also attempts to drop a battalion on top of mine, but they fail their shard cannon save and nothing lands. I, however, am much luckier and get both of the battalion drops out of the Aldrin to support the currently existing ground forces. And for my opponent's last activation of the round, the gargoyle that I thought I was going to be super cool and smart and awesome and block just moves to a position where it can still drop anyway with no problem. And they do get another battalion down onto that contested feature. For my last activation, it is my 2 strike carriers. They put down 2 battalions onto the now open drop site in the back, and I also remember Detector this time and dump a bunch of spikes on the Lamasu. There are no relevant drop site activations to take care of, so we move on to the asset phase. And first up, battalion combat. Around the central drop site, there is the one feature that has 3 of mine, 2 of theirs, and so we're left with 1 remaining resistance battalion, and the drop site overall remains contested. On the Nova Prospect drop site, the 1 Scourge battalion is cleared out at the cost of 1 of my battalions. So that drop site remains contested as well because they still have their orbital gun present. There's 1 boarding action to take care of with the remaining battalion on Nguyen, and they stick around after inflicting a point of damage. Launch assets are next, and my fighters go up first. I form up a few wings and get them adjacent to some bombers. I clear out some of the bombers. There's still two surviving, and I leave one fighter around because I'm worried about the incoming torpedo on Nguyen, and I want to have them available for rerolls. My first proper bomber attack of the game goes, and they fire into the Ifrit. They get 3 damage into it, bringing it down to a single hull point. The 2 remaining Scourge bombers converge on Nguyen, and they get a point of damage through the defenses. And to close out the round, that final torpedo collides with Nguyen. And despite the rerolls from the nearby fighter, it does pretty well for itself, doing 2 damage, starting a fire, and adding 2 more boarders onto Nguyen. And for repairs, the Ifrit gets its thrusters back online. Nguyen, again thanks to the nearby triumvir, puts out its fire, but unfortunately for me, the Gladiator still has its defense systems stay offline. End of round 5, and I've made some good progress on clawing back from 8 points behind. We'll see how things end as the final round is next. So as round 6 began, I had one major priority, which is that I did not want to let them destroy any more of my ships, because I was pretty sure they were right under a breakpoint for getting more points with attrition. So I activated the Gladiator to take out the Ifrit, because that was the thing I was most worried about, considering the Gladiator was only 3 hull points and defenses offline. The Ifrit could easily have killed it if I gave it a chance. I swat it down with a weapons free, and luckily only get reactor rupture for the explosion effect. One of the Hydras moves into scald range on Nguyen and tries to get some damage in, but it fails to punch through the backup save. They do launch 3 bombers. With Nguyen's activation, I considered doing damage control, but I think as is, the actual safer thing to do is to take out that Lamasu to minimize the chance of them dropping more on the central drop site, and try to take out the Hydra in one go, so it doesn't have a chance to score those 2 points and clear out my box of scraps. And I do just that. I forgot to take the picture of the after, but both the Hydra and Lamasu were destroyed. My opponent activates the first of their gargoyles. They fire a shot at Nguyen, doesn't do anything, and try to drop a battalion down. It fails the Scourge battery reroll thing, and they spend their only AP on the reroll for that, but fail again. My Aldrin activates, and I also fail both of the rolls to land my battalions and spend 2 AP to reroll them. Luckily for me, they both go through. Number 2 of the 3 gargoyles activates, and they do get their battalion dropped down. Number 2 of the 3 gargoyles activates, and they do get their battalion dropped down. So whether the central drop site remains contested or under Scourge control pretty much comes down to this one drop. The gargoyle attempts to put a battalion down, while also firing off a shot at Nguyen, and they do not make the roll. The battalion is shot down by the Scourge orbital battery on the way, and the site will remain contested. Oh, and that last final shot filled with spite at Nguyen just misses. At this point, it's just going through and making sure I do the necessary things to wrap up the game, and then we'll see how the score looks. So first up, another gather intel on the Nova Prospect drop site. The third and final gather intel with the Senator on the backfield drop site. 2 more battalions get dropped for the hell of it. And we move on to battalion combat in the acid phase, as there are no relevant drop site activations. On the central drop site, our battalions clash, and we are both left with 1 on the drop site, so it is contested. For boarding actions, all 3 hits go through and trigger a box of scraps, and I'm forced to spend an AP on a reroll and hope for the best, because at first I only rolled 1, which still would have left Nguyen dead. Luckily, I got a 3 hull point recovery on the reroll, and Nguyen survives the game. Launch assets are up, and I have some fighters that are going to clear out a bomber wing, and with those bombers gone, that is it for game actions. Now we move on to checking the victory points. I now control the Scourge deployment zone drop site as well as Nova Prospect drop site. The central drop site remains contested, while One World Trade Center remains under Scourge control, meaning that for this round of standard scoring, I get 8 VP while Scourge gets 4. We start with standard scoring, which is the drop site control. Scourge is up 4 with 14 VP versus my 10 VP. and attrition scoring, which is the second primary way to score VPs on this scenario, which is for every 500 points of ships and admirals who kill, you get 2 VP. The Scourge are just shy of 1,000 and only get 2 VP. I just broke 1,500 and get the full possible 6 VP. And finally, for our secondary scoring, the Scourge claims 3 VP for their take prizes, and I get 3 VP for gather in. And we've got ourselves a tie of 19 victory points each. In the event of ties, victory goes to the person with the most kill points, meaning with my 1,515 kill points, I take the game. And so the remnant forces of humanity have successfully established a foothold in New York, gathered the intelligence they needed for further operations, and driven back the Scourge. Well, of course, we know the victory came down to my incredible strategic mind and perfect tactical acumen, and not the fact that there was a couple lucky rolls in the end that were what enabled me to have the tie that tipped me over to victory with the kill points, which actually I'm fairly happy with because this was an asymmetric scenario, so I wasn't actually expecting to win. Now, this was only our second game, but playing it, there were some thoughts about things like individual ship balance. For example, we felt like all the furnace cannon Scourge ships were pretty pillow-fisted, and we have some opinions about launch. Like, we both really liked how launch works now with persistent assets, but not being able to launch on weapons free really hindered both of us. And that, especially Nguyen, like I never used a single torpedo because I always wanted to go weapons free with overcharging weapons and whatever. And I could have launched one in the very first round, but I was just thinking, oh, well, I'll get closer. Torpedoes are slow. I can launch turns 2 through 6 when I'm closer. And yeah, that didn't pan out. Anyway, I'm going to collect my thoughts and try to write up a general review idea thing about the new version of Dropfleet later. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed the video and have a good one.